because we've got a speaker today. And just by chance, we were talking to each other, and he said something about, giving a paper to the Congressional Caucus about reparations. And I said, really? The Congressional Caucus? You mean Raleigh or Washington? He said, oh, Washington. No. Now, and somebody asked me, well, what did you do in real life? I don't know what you did in real life. I just know that you have a string of stuff that you did when you were in New York City, but I don't know what you did in real life. So please, as you start, give us a little bit more personal background. His talk this morning is I Too Am America, a case for reparations for the descendants of African slaves. Ed Hull, second vice chair of the Spencer Party. Go to it, man.
Jeffrey, thank you so very much, okay? And I appreciate it, okay? I think the first thing I'd like to say is a special good morning to all of my fellow Democrats, and good morning to all of you as my brothers and sisters in the struggle. And Jeffrey, thank you so very much for inviting me to do this. And Kenneth, thank you so very much for all of your technical assistance. I'm going to keep my remarks for the sake of time very limited, just in terms of the introduction of myself. But just briefly, since retiring and moving to Salisbury, North Carolina in October of 2006, I have served as the treasurer of the Rowan Arts Council and the Zoning Board of Adjustment here in the town of Spencer. And I did that for approximately 5 years. Presently, as Jeff has mentioned, I'm the vice chair of our Spencer precinct, and I was appointed by the board of directors of Waterworks Visual Arts Center in 2017 to be a member of the board. And now I serve as the president of the board of directors. Just briefly, prior to moving here, I think most people know, excuse me, that my wife and I are natives of Westchester County, New York. And for those who don't know about Westchester, Westchester is north of Manhattan, and it's midways between Manhattan and Connecticut. I grew up and I'm from a community known as White Plains. White Plains is the county seat of Westchester County. My wife is from Mount Vernon. You've heard of Mount Vernon before, Denzel, Washington. And you can kind of go on and on. So that's my background and roots. And some of the other things that I have done will come out in my presentation this morning. I hope not to bore you. I've tried to keep this limited. And this presentation that I give to you this morning was submitted in writing to Representative Karen Bass, Democrat, California, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, the United States House of Representatives, on June the 20th of last year. Its primary focus was to offer a rather detailed and accurate overview on our African American or Black struggle for reparations over the past 56 years, and the promise that was made in January of 1865. And I'll talk about that in my presentation to you and what that entailed. And right at this moment, we have a demand for action. I've done an extensive amount of research and reading over the past few years regarding the subject of reparations for for the descendants of African slaves. I've read that the United States government had made a landmark settlement to pay the Navajo Nation $554 million. I approve of this, as I also agree with all of the other millions and billions of dollars that have been paid out to other Indian tribes throughout America, such as some Sioux and Ottawa Native Americans and others. I also approve of the reparations that were paid out to Japanese Americans as a result of their forced internment during World War II, due to our government's willingness to right their wrong. My only question to America is, how long, America? How much longer do the descendants of African slaves have to continue to endure one of history's worst injustices, whose ancestors were auctioned off like cattle, kept in bondage, and forced to perform free labor from sunup to sundown, with as many as 25 million lives lost, and not one formal apology since the abolition of slavery. How long, America, must we wait for our 40 acres and a mule? And for some of you might not know, and I'll always remind you, let's not forget the $50 in cash. Reparations stem from a breach of contract between newly freed slaves and the United States government. The former period of slavery that began in 1619 and ended as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation signed in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. In January of 1865, slaves were promised, among other things, a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, one mule, and $50 in cash. And that was in Special Field Order number 15, as promised by the Freeman Bureau and issued by General William T. Sherman. But 3 months later, the order was rescinded by President Andrew Johnson, and the government seized the land that they had already given to some 40,000 ex-slaves in Florida and South Carolina. In the end, more than 4 million men, women, and children were freed without a cent. But many people who have not read US history feel that this claim is unsubstantiated. Anything less, to me, would represent an intolerable application of responsibility against humanity. And let me say right now, we're not looking for a check in the mail. Perhaps some of us are, but I'll talk about that. As cited in an article entitled "The Case for Reparations" by Charles J. Ogletree, Jr., a renowned Harvard law professor, in USA Weekend magazine, dated August the 16th through the 18th in 2002. Being that a bipartisan Congress agreed to pay each aggrieved Japanese $20,000 each as a result of their forced internment during World War II. And after the abolition of slavery, get to this, slave owners themselves were paid by our government compensation for the loss of property. The loss of property. You know what their property was, right? Slaves. How can this be? And yet, to this day, there has not been any form of compensatory payment or otherwise to the descendants of African slaves as a direct result of the Atlantic slave trade. In 2014, prominent American journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates published an article titled "The Case for Reparations," which discussed the continued effects of slavery and Jim Crow laws and made renewed demands for reparations. Coates makes reference to Representative John Conyers Jr. aforementioned H.R. 40 bill, pointing out that Congress' failure to pass this bill expresses a lack of willingness to right their past wrongs. In September of 2016, the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent encouraged Congress to pass the aforementioned H.R. 40 bill to study several reparation proposals. The report noted that there exists a legacy of racial inequality in the United States, explaining that despite substantial changes since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, ideology ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. The report further notes that a dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion among the United States population. Therefore, as a result of H.R. 40 bill not even coming to the floor of the House of Representatives for a vote in its approximately 30-year history, I personally, and we, the people of African descent, demand that this matter be taken up by the Black Caucus of the United States House of Representatives. I propose to the American people, to the Black Caucus of the House of Representatives and the United States Congress on how the United States government can immediately begin the process of paying reparations to the descendants of African slaves. We can do this by reinstituting the concept of revenue sharing and our block grants, by which the federal government can provide funding to the descendants of African slaves. And this is explained in the concluding paragraphs about the author. And I'll leave it brief regarding myself as the author. There are a couple of things I'd like to highlight. Ed Hull is the grandson of Appel and Carrie Jackson, who were sharecroppers in rural Darlington County, South Carolina. Their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were slaves who worked from sunup to sundown. Ed is a retired chief executive officer from the field of community development, community action, community-based economic development, affordable housing, and neighborhood revitalization. He holds 2 degrees, a bachelor's in biology from Western Michigan University after he had attended Michigan State University for 1 year, and an MBA from a local college in his state of New York known as Mercy College, which was a joint weekend program sponsored by Mercy College and Long Island University. During the course of my employment years, approximately 35, heading up 501c3 not-for-profit corporations, a large portion of my funding came from the federal government by way of revenue sharing, and in later years, block grants. I'm very familiar with the funding and the overall process. For those who are familiar with or unfamiliar with this, the United States government implemented revenue sharing between 1972 and 1986 in the form of congressional appropriations of federal tax revenue to states, cities, counties, and townships. Revenue sharing was extremely popular with state officials, but lost federal support during the Reagan administration in 1987. It was replaced with block grants in smaller amounts to reduce the federal revenue given to states. However, both concepts were based largely on the number of poor and minority individuals and households in certain communities. Based on this census, we have a large number of qualified economists who can help calculate and determine the amount of funding that can be received by communities for reparations, enabling them to provide a host of funding to the descendants of African slaves by providing down payments for home ownership, pay for college tuition, provide funding and capital for startup businesses and other entrepreneurial opportunities, training youth for new and future technology jobs, creating affordable housing, and repairing dilapidated buildings, crumbling streets and sidewalks, and a host of other things and activities. And also, maybe just simply not paying federal income tax for a number of years. As I was pointing out, that there's a host of other activities and things that can be done. A combination of these plus more, but that's a study that have to be done by the commission. In conclusion, let me say that slavery was an enterprise and big business for all of America, in particular the South, as well as the North. Everyone, except for the slaves themselves and their offsprings, reaped the fruits of slavery. The cotton trade made New York City, and it also, that New York City made cotton trade itself. And I'd like to point out that for a more detailed historical and economic analysis. You can also pick up a copy of From Here to Eternity by William A. Doherty and his wife, A. Kirsten Mullen. And it talks about reparations for Black Americans in the 21st century. And I know that Jeffrey also have a copy of this. I received mine, Jeffrey, in the mail a couple of weeks ago. And let me leave with this, my conclusion. And it really is a piece of good news. On January the 4th of this year, Representative Barbara Lee, 13th Congressional District, California. She was the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. She has reintroduced HR 40 bill in the House. That's a piece of good news. And with our new administration, we're praying and hoping that this come up on the floor. And keep in mind, HR 40 bill, something that was proposed in 1989 by Representative Conyers. So I thank you for your attention. And that concludes what I'd like to report to you. Have a nice day. And I'd like to wish everyone a happy and blessed Thanksgiving. Not Thanksgiving, but I mean a happy Valentine's Day. Okay, and enjoy it. For all of us also, in conclusion, enjoy the remaining Black History Month, because this is a month that is a wonderful month. And I'm glad for this opportunity that I could render this presentation during this Black History Month. Thank you, Jeffrey, and I thank you all for your attention. Have a nice day.